Hello and welcome to Amazing Meetings. This is the show for the people who want to make a difference in the room.
Hi, my name is Louis, all the way from South Africa.
And my name is Bartosz, all the way from Poland.
Our guest is Mark Chivere, and Mark has worked with hundreds of managers throughout the African continent and beyond. And he's considered by his peers as one of the leading individuals in human performance and is sought after in areas of understanding individual behavior, managing people, and business performance through developing high-performance teams. As the Regional Director of TTI Success Insights South Africa, as well as the Managing Director of Trimio, a company based in the Netherlands, Mark's company is extremely passionate and committed to individual and team success by focusing on personal development, leadership development, team development, and assessment tools. Now, we got Mark in specifically to talk about understanding the personalities in the room. And Bartosz, this was a conversation I am so excited that we had.
Hi Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your background. So what made you become a professional facilitator?
Okay, my background is in sales. I think I was a sales superstar everywhere that I worked. And then I met my wife, who's got a learning and development background. And she kind of thought, hey, what you do could be interesting for other people to learn. You know, and we kept talking about it. And then one day there was, I think there was a consulting company. You know the whole story, facilitator got sick or something. I don't remember what happened, but then they needed somebody and they said, hey, maybe you could just jump into the room and do something. So I went in there and totally unprepared, but I just went in and I was me and they liked it. And then they called me back and then they called me back again. And then I kind of thought, hey, maybe I'm good at this. And then I started really just kind of investing in myself around facilitating and ended up getting certified in a number of products and a number of programs, did some coaching certifications as well, because this was all the stuff that was kind of within that territory, so to speak.
Mark, so one of the things that from my personal experience that I know about you is that you are awesome in understanding people and understanding the personalities in the room. Do you quickly want to share a story about an interesting person that you met in a room, a horror story, a good story, something just to get to whet our appetites for the conversation that we're about to have?
Oh, wow. I think over the years I've had quite a few. I think the most interesting ones are the ones with the most senior people in the room. You know, I remember we're doing a project for this one organization, and we had the most senior person who would waltz in to just say a few words, and then they would leave. You know, and it kind of created that they were okay, and everybody else in the room, there was something wrong with them. And for me as a facilitator, I was there to fix them. And then each time they thought of something, they would come back again and just put in a message. And the challenge is that the organization was working through a lot of change. So at some point I had to literally hold their hand so that they don't leave, you know, so that they can be part of the process. And initially they kind of, you know, tried to make it really clear that I'm boss here. But I think I'm an expert in my process, you know. So eventually we had a short break, and then I went out and I had a conversation with them, and I literally threatened to say, hey, you know what, this is not working. And the reason why it's not working is because leadership is not buying in. Each time you leave, part of the feedback is, you know, leadership needs to be in here to be able to go through the process with us. And yeah, because a lot of the times as facilitators, we almost run, there's a little bit of a risk of being used as mouthpieces of leadership. And a lot of the times, even as you take a brief from a client, you're able to kind of pick up the nuances of maybe there's an issue and the leadership doesn't want to say it, so they hire you under the guise of a 2-day workshop, but they really want you to just pass on this message. Yeah. So lots of those, and I'm sure I'll probably share another one or two as we move on.
Mark, so with that in mind, I quickly want to ask, if we're standing in front of a room as facilitators, why is it important for us to know who we're talking to? And from your professional point of view, what are some of the characteristics or some of the personalities that a facilitator should be looking out for when presenting to a room?
I think it's always important to just have an understanding of who your audience is, and the first part of that is understanding your brief. Understanding your brief, I often ask anything that I need to watch out for. I ask for, have they done a similar program? Have they done similar work? What worked? What didn't work? So a lot of that kind of gives you some insights. And also to ask around, the impact and what are they trying to solve for. And if you really ask good quality questions, before you even get into the room, you get an indication. And I've had situations where people have even pointed out some naughty children, so to speak, people to watch out for, and and that kind of thing. And all of that is information that you can use to be able to really deliver a good program and good value for the organization. And then when it also comes to just personalities, I like getting into the room really, really early. I want to be the first person in the room. And as people come in, you can see as people look for maybe a place to sit, or they're looking for maybe a quick coffee, and how they interact with you, how they interact with their colleagues. All of that is information for a facilitator that you're able to leverage once your session actually starts.
So you mentioned the DISC model as your sort of lens that you use to look at people. Now, for someone who's completely new to the world of psychometry or personal development or even coaching, because it feels like this DISC model is such a cross-functional thing that you can use in so many contexts, could you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it works?
Okay, so the DISC model, to just backtrack a little bit, was a gentleman called Marston, William Moulton Marston, wrote a book in the 20s where he spoke about the 4 different types of behavioral dimensions. So he didn't use the acronym DISC. This came years after, but he's the one who put together basically and described the 4 different dimensions, which are dominance, influencing, steadiness, and compliance, which is the DISC. Commonly referred to as the DISC model. So with dominance, you get people who essentially walk into the room like they own the room, and they are about results, and it sometimes can be mistaken for being arrogant, almost. And then you've got the influencers wear their emotions on their sleeves. These are the people who walk in and they tend to be expressive, and they'll talk about the traffic, and they'll talk about their relationships, and they respond expressively. And then you've got the steadiness. The steadiness is almost the poker face. These are the people who generally you have no idea what they're thinking, but they tend to make deep and meaningful relationships. These are the people who will come straight to me as the facilitator in the room and greet me, and ask me questions about me as a person. Whereas the dominance might ask something about, okay, when are we starting? Something that's functional to the session. And then you've got the compliance. The compliance tends to be more around they're very time specific and also very analytical. So every time you share a little bit of information, they might want to know, so where does that come from? And they want to verify and double check things. So that's what the behavioral framework is talking about when we're talking about DISC.
Well, thank you so much for clarifying that. And which one is you? So which is your dominant driver feature?
So what's interesting is that whenever I facilitate, especially if it's a behavioral type session, I get asked this question a lot. and I often refer it to right at the end, and I ask people to guess, and more often than not, they get it wrong. And there's a reason why. So my behavioral style is that I lead with a C, which is compliance. But on our DISC tool, I've got a 99 score of C. And then just behind that, I've got the D, the dominance. So I'm pretty analytical. And I'm generally introverted, but I want to get up and let's go. It's all about results, all at the same time. But now when you're facilitating, right? Now, when you're facilitating, you're really dialing up the I. So a lot of the times people think, because especially if it's people who don't know me, they think that I lead with the I behavioral dimension because that's what they have experienced for the few hours or few days that they're with me. Yeah.
Mark, I can so identify with some of the guys that we spoke about, specifically with regards to the dominance. There's many times there's guys in the room and it almost feels like they're urging you along to get done. It's like you're never moving fast enough. So if we're sitting in a room and especially with the sales guys who are many of them are like task orientated, goals orientated. If we have a room and there's a big, strong contingency of high D guys, high dominance guys, how do we as facilitators actually structure the session, or what are some of the tricks that we can do to address these guys that are really the wants to get this stuff done quickly?
Okay, so one thing that's really important for the dominance dimension is really control. So a lot of the times when somebody who leads with this dimension, control is a very, very big priority for them. So the first thing that I typically do, and this I do for every session, whether I've identified any people who lead with this dimension or not, is that I give them autonomy. And part of that giving autonomy is that it doesn't matter what this program, it could be a program on sales, on leadership, on EQ, whatever it is. I first start off with an exercise where people set up their own rules. People comply to their own rules a lot better than the rules that you give them. Let alone this facilitator that they've just met for the first time, like an hour ago, or for some of them who might have been 10 minutes ago. So the first thing is I just lay it out, put out some flip charts, and I say, okay, I've got a couple of questions for you guys to respond, give them some post-it notes, and say, what are the rules for the next day or 2 days, however long the program is? What are the rules that you think we need to kind of hold ourselves to? And it's quite interesting. People write all the obvious great stuff that we need to respect each other, we need to respect time, we need to do all of those things. And I keep that flip chart up, and at the end of the exercise, I'll say, hey, can I hold you to that for the next couple of days? And everybody generally agrees. And then when we take it on from there, when the behavioral dimensions now start coming to the fore, I've got something to lean on, and I keep pointing them to that these are the rules that you made. And a lot of the times, if it's a kind of like a leadership program and we're having challenges, I then have a space to be able to get in and actually be a little bit tough on the guys and say, hey, if you're a leadership team and you can't respect your own rules, maybe that's the reason why we're having the challenges that we're having. Yeah.
So what are some of the rules that usually emerge in an exercise like that?
Well, generally it's around timekeeping, it's about respecting each other, it's about understanding that I'm the facilitator and I'm going to be kind of coordinating the process and respecting that. And sometimes if there's pieces that I feel they have left out, I'll suggest them. At this point in the morning, people will agree to anything. And they will put their heads on the blocks for almost anything. They'll be like, yeah, that you can hold us to account. But obviously, they don't know what they're getting themselves into. But it allows to give me a platform to be able to keep the room in check somewhat.
So that's specifically referring to how to manage the guys with the dominance. Now, on the other side of the reality is that the guys you refer to as steadiness, And you said that these guys, you can't actually read them. And many times they don't necessarily contribute from themselves or just put up a hand to make a contribution. So if you have those almost wallflower guys sitting in a room, what are some of the tricks that you can use to draw them out and to actually make them participate in the conversations? If it's setting up rules, if it's giving their opinions on something, how do you draw those guys out to actually participate?
Yeah, so I think that previous exercise sets that up well, in that if we have, because typically you're going to get the high Ds and the high Is almost jumping in, participating, so it gives me leverage as a facilitator to then be able to draw some of the intelligence from the people who lead with the high S. Because a lot of the times, even in the workplace, you almost want to be able to allow a space to say, hey, Sam or Susan, what do you think about this? Because one of the key things around facilitating is actually not being the expert in the room. It's really being able to leverage, because a lot of the times when you facilitate, for me, in my experience, I'm always facilitating to people who I think are smarter than me. So it's really around leveraging the smartness that's in the room. And even with questions, I don't have to answer every question, and somebody asks the question, I'll put it to the floor, and it's amazing how the responses come out. And sometimes, as you learn the names and you pick up the different behavioral styles, I can have a very decent blend between picking people out and asking them to respond to a question, and also having a process where you mix and match the groups, so that you're not having, because quite easily people will kind of just be attracted to like people. So you end up with the high Ds on their own, with the high Is, and so you have all these processes to just mix people up and make sure that you keep everybody engaged.
Mark, one of the experiences that I've had is when grouping people, there's always someone that puts up their hand and says, I'll be the spokesperson, I'll be the person that speaks. And many times we have like 4 or 5 voices in the room that kind of projects the feeling of the whole room, or we think they project the feeling of the whole room. And those are many times the high I guys, the influencing guys that you spoke about. And between them and the dominant guys, they will take over a conversation, much like I'm doing now. They'll just keep on talking and talking and talking. And every time you say something, they'll come back and they'll ask a question. They want the attention on them. And we've all been in situations where that's one guy in the room, and it's almost getting to the point of being counterproductive, because he's chipping in and he wants to add the whole time. So how do we manage those type of people in the room?
I think I've had a couple of situations where that was the case. And in one of them, I ended up acknowledging their contribution and saying that in one of the breaks, because as a facilitator, I can always sacrifice one of my breaks, maybe it's the next tea break, and say, hey, I think you're onto something there. But for the sake of the progress and for everybody else, to kind of come along with us, why don't we have that conversation either maybe during one of the breaks, or we can sit together over lunch and, hash it out. Because sometimes you do get, situations where you get stuck on something that is very often immaterial to what you are driving at, but you have this individual who's just into it, So that's one of the ways, to almost take it offline, so to speak.
Wow, thanks, Mark. Well, for dealing with Louis, we have specialized software and I'm able to cut out what he said into more mute, more concise blocks and everything. But for people, it's not so easy, right? Whether you have a real life situation in the room, sometimes you have situations of conflict appearing, and looking at a conflict situation in the room through the DISC lens. Now, what's the prescription here? So how would you deal with a contingency?
Well, I think one of the things is that if you have identified the different dimensions well, then it becomes a lot easier. You know that, the high Ds generally looking for autonomy. Autonomy is very important for them, and they don't want to feel like they're not in control. And also the high Cs, for example, for them, they want to verify and they don't want to be embarrassed. They want to make sure that they're doing it right the first time. So all you want to do is to really feed into those. Allow them. The high eyes sometimes want to be the center of attention. And sometimes they feel that you as the facilitator are grabbing all the attention because you are in the center of the room. So allow them to almost in a productive way to share some of that limelight. So sometimes I would see somebody who's getting a little bit restless, but I want to keep them productive. So I'll ask them, hey, I'm setting up the next exercise. Do you want to give me a hand? Keep them busy. Let them get up. Let them feel that, they're getting some sort of satisfaction because their behavioral dimension is asking for this, and that allows them to actually get that much more engaged.
So it looks like this is a very useful tool or a skill to have in a professional setup where we have a training room full of people. We want to see how they interact. We want to understand really fast what the connections are, what the potential lines of conflict would be. It seems like this is a perfect tool for a manager to understand in his team's or her team's context, to see how people are interacting. But I always try to look for the human side of things. So could you think of a way this could be used in, I would say, real life, somewhere not in a professional context?
In real life, okay. So I think in just one-on-one conversations, for example. So if I was a manager and I'm having a conversation or a one-on-one meeting with a direct report of mine, knowing and understanding what their DISC profile looks like will give me some insight on making sure that all our interactions are a success and I get what I want from them and the next person gets what they want from them. For example, if I know that they lead high S, for example, if there's something I want to talk about, I'm not going to bring up surprises from nowhere because they're not going to be prepared for them. And generally, people who lead with this dimension don't like that. So I'll give them a hint if there's something that they need to prepare. But if they're a high I instead, they'll be able to just take it on the fly, quite literally. So there's all of these examples that even in real life with friends, family, significant others, the same is true.
So Mark, let's get back to the room. So we've spoken about DISC and we've spoken about the personalities. But one of the things that also comes to the fore many times is the whole thing of a power dynamic. And sometimes when we're having facilitation, we're doing something like there's a conflict management. This is where the dirty laundry comes out. This is where the power dynamics come into play. So as a facilitator, specifically if you're doing something with regards to team effectiveness, leadership, conflict management, better communication skills, how do you manage the hierarchy of power, the team leader versus the rest of the team? Like you alluded to earlier, the manager of the group coming in and then leaving. How do we take those power dynamics into consideration when we're doing facilitation?
I think that's a very, very good question because I think a lot of great facilitation falls flat when somebody who's really good at what they do misses out on just that. And I think it's really, really important to have an understanding of those power dynamics in terms of the structure of an organization, who holds what role, but there's also other unwritten power dynamics, that are in organization. And I've found that sometimes you get the most influential person in the room is not the person who holds the highest office on the organogram, and sometimes you see these dynamics as a facilitator, and they're often very, very important, especially when you're dealing with change and leadership or asking people to change something or to do something new. You want to make sure that you've got wind in your sails and leveraging some of this power, but in a healthy way for the rest of the group. So depending on the context of what it is exactly that you're trying to solve for, then you would leverage. So I'll give an example. I think it was a sales program that we were running, and we had this team give us like a real life example where they had a challenge. And then because I've been working with this team on an ongoing basis. One of the challenges that they had is that they were selling to an organization. They were selling a time in attendance and an access control system to an organization. And in this organization, what they didn't realize was that this organization had like an internal security team. But the head of that team was one of the dads of one of the directors, right? And when these guys came with their pitch, they asked them all the right questions and say, okay, so what are you doing about security? What are you doing about access? What do you spend? Oh yeah, and then they answered, we've got a team, we've got this and that, it costs us X amount. And then they came up with a presentation that says, you know what, we will cut down these costs for you, we'll cut down those costs for you, and a couple of these positions that are costing you X amount are going to be redundant because we're going to automate everything, And they didn't get the deal because your system is recommending that this guy fires his father, who is the head of security, So it means that head of security, who's got an office in the basement, has a lot of power and a lot of influence, But when you look at the organogram, it doesn't look that way, So it's very important to really just pay attention to some of the details of what's really going on. And that's the only way you can actually get to the bottom of issues. Because power does not only sit in the CEO's office. Joseph Grenning, one of the authors of Crucial Conversations, often said that, people have varying levels of power in organizations, but no one is powerless. And that was just a case in point.
So, Mark, one of the things that, as we're talking through all these personalities in the room, I know that you said that you're a high compliance person. So this is a question for you. Many times as facilitators, we're standing in front of the room and we make a statement. And like you said, the person kind of puts up his hand and says, okay, but where did you get that? Do you have proof to facilitate that, or not to facilitate, to quantify that? Where did you get that information? And it's almost like you're playing defense with information with the guys in the room. Specifically, if you're trying to convey a message. And like you said earlier, it's not always like you're the specialist in the room. So how do you manage that? How do you manage that need for qualification and explaining where you're coming from with the information that you're sharing?
So I think there's a balance, sometimes, because I like to keep the sessions almost conversational. In the sense that as a facilitator, you like I said before, you're not the expert in the room in a lot of cases. In some cases maybe you are. But how I like to keep that balance is really, I know that people who lead high C tend to want to dot the I's and cross the T's, want to fact check stuff. Blah, blah. So I want to have all of the information. I often recommend just have all of your information, have your citations. You don't have to put, hundreds of citations on your slides. It makes slides really look terrible, but have the information. So what I often do is that when somebody asks, I have the information at the tip of my fingertips, or there's a handout that has got all that extra information that I would either give to everybody, or sometimes I'll just keep. And then for those people that ask, and I'll just give them the little extras. And also sometimes I can send you some extra information. Give me an email address, depending on the program that I'm running, because the high Cs tend to be very comfortable dealing with a lot of information and a lot of data. And also one of the challenges for a lot of people who lead high Cs there is analysis paralysis, is that it becomes very difficult for them to move until they're happy about this piece of information. And if you're not careful, they could stall the facilitation and the process. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Mark. So if I were to collect all of that together, so the whole DISC profile in the room, so you mentioned that you prepare ahead of the training situation with the fact-checking and everything else to cater to the high control people in the room. So are there any other things you do to cater to other personalities that you might encounter in a professional setting?
So I like to cater for the 4 dimensions, and basically I've mentioned the dominance, and I've also mentioned the high compliance. Now, for the eyes, generally they announce themselves when they walk into the room. They just can't help it, So, but I've had situations where I wasn't very sure as the session started. So one of the things I like to do is, with that exercise that I mentioned earlier, I ask people, I put the flip charts on the wall, like on the furthest part of the room, and I ask people to actually stand up and walk to the flip charts. And as people are doing that, you're observing behaviors, and behaviors are very, very telling, Or the other thing is, because a lot of my sessions always have exercises, is I'll ask a question like, can I have 2 or 3 volunteers to just help me set up the next exercise? The first 2, before I've even finished asking that sentence, that question, the first 2-3 people that volunteer, I already know, typically they are high I's. Because the high C's will not volunteer. They want to know, volunteer for what first? And they want to know because they're very risk averse. So all of these things, as we are doing exercises, the exercise has its own objectives, and we're going to debrief. But as we are doing it, I'm also looking, and I think if you have been doing this for as long as I have, you can't help but notice these nuances as people behave, and behavior is observable after all.
Well, Mark, so you are way ahead on your DISC journey than any of us here. And I bet most of our listeners would be interested to learn, how can you begin learning about DISC so that it becomes this useful tool that helps you notice different behaviors and helps you understand how you can help these people out to achieve their goals?
I think it really starts off with just, there's a lot of material out there. There's a lot of books that have been written about personality. There's a lot of authors. There's also a lot of tools out there. It probably starts off with, I would recommend getting an accreditation in a good DISC research-based tool. There's a lot of very fluffy ones all over the internet. And I think get a good one. You generally get what you pay for, and or alternatively come to us, do an accreditation, learn about DISC. But that's just the first stage. The next stage is really getting your hands dirty with the material, and developing yourself and learning about other related or relatable models, whether it's around leadership or it's around coaching, and just growing and getting opportunities to either speak or facilitate, and just interacting with a lot of people. And I was fortunate that this work has given me the opportunity to travel around the world and interact with many different cultures, and that just adds to your skill set, basically.
Mark, I want to ask a question on that with regards to, you said traveling around the world, and one of the things that we sometimes don't want to address or take into consideration is that there's different cultures in the room as well. What are some of the things that we as facilitators need to be cognizant of when we're looking at the cultures in the room and how that plays out in a facilitation session?
I think that is absolutely critical, especially now, because I remember probably a few months ago, I facilitated a session where there was 18 people in the room, and there were not 2 people who came from the same country. So it was like diversity on steroids. And what was interesting was that you then get to learn about different cultures and different people. And I think part of that brief that you get before you walk into a room or before you get a specific job, and I think you really need to have two or three very good questions around expectations, around culture. There will always be a specific culture that you may never have heard of or you have never experienced, and there's no way you're going to walk into a room an expert. And I think also just allowing yourself to be curious, and that allows you to almost prune a lot of those sweeping statements that we make without even realizing.
So how do you develop your own facilitation skills to be able to keep up with so many different angles and dynamics that you need to take into account as a facilitator in the room?
I think number one is just the drive and the passion. If you have the drive and you're passionate about what you do, then it's going to be a lot easier. And then number two is really planning and structuring things. I often say the odds favor the person with a plan. And just continuous learning. Reading is one. Reading a lot of material that leverages what you do, and you can always leverage a lot of content, and you get a lot of skills around storytelling, and I think just continuous learning. I think if you feel that you are done with learning, this probably wouldn't be the space for you. Yeah.
Mark, I just want to reflect on that. I think we said earlier that many times we're not the specialists in the room when it comes to the content. There's many things that we don't understand about the intricacies of the companies that we're in. But the one thing that we are specialists in is that we're specialist facilitators. And to keep on, sharpening that sword of understanding the people that we're presenting to, understanding the cultures we're presenting to, understanding the concepts that you just mentioned, like storytelling, structuring, having activities that draws people out, and really being present, not just in saying, here I am, I'm presenting, but getting to the point of saying, here I am, I'm presenting to you, and who are you, and how I need to adapt and be able to adapt my presentation style to really get to the point of saying what I intended in sharing with you, I know that you got at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think, and this is going to touch on the question that Bartosz asked earlier around sort of the journey, that if I was speaking to somebody who is new in this game, one of the things I would recommend is that get yourself able to facilitate and able to keep people captive and interested and engaged in what you're doing, without, even if you don't have a projector. We had a number of years ago a situation where we were at a hotel in Juba in South Sudan, and the electricity went out, so all the projectors were out. And obviously some of the facilitators were really, really flustered. And one of the comments that came back was, they were blown away at that had very little impact in the facilitation, because we carried on, because we knew our stuff, and we just used a lot more flip charts. We drew stuff and created stuff, but we had no idea when the electricity was going to come back, and it came back like 5-6 hours later, and we couldn't have just sit and folded our arms for that time, because that's the time that the client is paying us for, So I think there's a lot. Allow yourself to be curious. Allow yourself to learn. To always get into a space. Even sometimes I get asked to speak to young people in high school. Just allow yourself to learn. There's always something that you can learn that you didn't know before. It's very different from when you walk into a room with your nose in the air and being the expert. In the moment you have that kind of attitude, you almost stop yourself from being able to learn.
So you mentioned the endless art of improvisation being one of the most useful fields a facilitator could excel in. Well, no doubt about that. That comes from my experience. I think Louis shared a couple of moments like that as well with us. And so there's one thing. We also know that the art and science of facilitation connects very well to the field of coaching. So, there are many components out there. And our previous guest on the show was Craig, a professional coach who actually shared how this all connects together. Now with you, Mark, we touched upon the field of psychometry, so applying a different lens on how you perceive people and how they interact with each other. But building on this learning journey that we're taking together, what do you think are some of the fields that would be good for facilitators to dip in?
I think sales is one, because ultimately everybody is selling something. When I'm standing in front of a room, I'm facilitating, I'm selling basically this model for this group of people to go through change. And they need to buy it, to be able to be engaged in it. So everybody is selling something. And I think that sometimes learning more around how sales cycles work and the psychology behind sales and decision making in sales, just it's almost invaluable for a facilitator. And also getting some of those behavioral feedback of, am I actually making progress? Are people actually engaged? I've had lots of people who would stand in front of a group of people, go through a session for about an hour, and they've no idea how it's going. So you almost want to learn that ability to be able to step in and step out. And I think that's one of the differences between, and I'm sure Louis can attest to that, between sort of being a speaker and being a facilitator. In that, as a facilitator, you're stepping in front and then stepping out and allowing other people to get in and sharing that knowledge. As opposed to when you are giving a keynote, that all the information is, yes, you're getting feedback, but the information is coming from the speaker to the audience.
Mark, I just want to say, with regards to that, yes, definitely. And I think one of the biggest things that needed to change for myself, going from a keynote speaker to a facilitator, is having a confidence in yourself to keep quiet. To actually, to ask the question to the audience and say, so, do you have questions? What about you? And really to open yourself up and to say, well, I don't have the answer. Or, what do you think? And to have tools with regards to that. And really trusting the room to come forth with the outcome that they want to co-create with you, rather than saying, here I am, I'm giving you all the information, and I'm walking out of there 45 minutes later, hoping that, what I shot at you, something stuck, and let's leave. Whereas the facilitation is really to the point of saying, I'm giving you this, give me back what I gave to you, reflect again, give me back, is anything unclear? And that's really challenging, because like you said, if you know what's going on in the room, that kind of reflects upon you of saying, okay, it's not going well. Okay, but why and how do we change that?
Yeah, absolutely. And in facilitation, it's like little bits of iteration throughout the day. You're almost iterating, having a look, is this working, is this not working? And for me, in all the environments I like to work, are the environments where the facilitator can actually gauge and say, okay, we're going to change the next exercise and we're going to have this one instead of that one. Simply because for this group and where we are, this is not working. So I tend to like spaces where there is that flexibility. And I know there's a lot of programs out there that are not designed that way. There is one road and that's the road that you move. But for me, I kind of prefer that ability to be able, for the facilitator to be able to gauge the energy in the room and respond accordingly.
All right. So you mentioned a lot of experimentation and iteration as you prepare yourself for the role. Well, your experience speaks through you, and I'm personally extremely humbled by your professional demeanor. But every time I see an expert like that, I know they have 2 or 3 tricks up their sleeve, and I just know that. So what are the quick and dirty tips you might have for our listeners out there who are just beginning their journeys?
A lot of people plan this and do accreditations and it just kind of ends there. They're waiting for perfection to happen first. I'm waiting for this client or that client. Just start. Look for, I think I remember we used to every year. I think probably in the last 3 years are the only times that we haven't done, but it's something that we want to do again, is we would go out to nonprofits that we know that don't have learning budgets and say, hey, we've got this to offer and this will be of value to you. Your commitment is your time, and we're going to facilitate a 2-day session at no cost to you. Are you up for it? And some will say, well, we don't have time, or we're currently going through this. They'll recommend a different time. And we had some of the really, big global organizations that we know that they have budgets for this, but we also know that as a nonprofit, the funding of nonprofits is changing nowadays. So they took us up on it. And some of them have actually become paying clients now. But that just allows you to start. It allows you to just keep active. It's one of those things that it just requires practice. The more you practice, the more people you are in front of, the more questions you get, the more people you interact with, and the better you get.
Well, thanks for sharing that tip. I think it's very useful just to, dive in head first, see what happens, put yourself out there. You also mentioned your company and what sort of model you use to put your name out there and really have an impact on your customers. Now, could you tell us a little bit more about what is it that you do and how to find your company?
Okay, so the company is called TTI SI. We're a global company. We're a research and assessments company. So we were talking about DISC. DISC is one of the tools that we develop, and all in all, we've got 5 different sciences, and behavior that's where we use DISC for. And then we've got another science called driving forces. So behavior is the how, and it's observable. Driving forces is the why. And then we've got EQ, competences, and axiology. So a full suite of psychometric tools. You can find us on ttisi.com, and all over the internet. You can just Google TTI. You'll probably find us. And if you want to be accredited on a tool, get online, fill in a form, and we'll get one of our consultants to reach out to you.
Well, we will make sure that all the details of your company are mentioned in the show notes for all those people driving now on their planes, etc., without access to their notepads. We'll make sure you can find Mark's details and his company's detail in the footnotes of the show.
Mark, anything else from your side in closing as we close today's session? Anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with?
I think one of the key things, and this is not just for facilitators, but just for people in general, is that the world is changing really, really fast. We need to change too. And I think one of the easiest ways to change is just to keep learning. Learn something new every day, every week, and keep yourself relevant.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. We've really learned a lot from you today. Thank you for making time for us and sharing your expertise with us here at Amazing Meetings.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Louis, we just said goodbye to Mark on our show. So what are the key takeaways from today's episode for you?
Bartosz, I think one of the main things that stood out for me is Mark's approach to the people in the room. So it's not only to the topics. And one of the things that I found really releasing is where he said he doesn't need to be the expert necessarily of the content. We need to know what we're talking about, but really to be the experts of facilitation and to understand the people in the room and how to approach them and how to really get them involved in the facilitation process. And I think as a facilitator, that's been one of the skills that I've found helped me immensely, is just to be other people focused in facilitation and saying, how do I take what I know or what I'm asked to present to you and present it in such a way that they actually get it. And taking the tips that Mark's just said is just, focusing on the other people and understanding where they're coming from is going to make a huge difference to me going forward.
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway was, I think I always like the quick and dirty advice. So that's my obvious answer. But I absolutely love the fact that he encouraged us as facilitators not to be scared by the model or by the facade that is sometimes put up by training companies, certification bodies out there, which is obviously very important for people to have to go through a certain process to get to the level of becoming a trainer is actually very important. But I love how he actually said it, that it's important for you just to start doing it, head first. Start, experiment, reiterate on that. So Mark has a very agile approach to his training and facilitation, which I absolutely loved and adored. And it was such a pleasure to be able to listen to him.
Well, I'm excited about our next episodes coming up. We are excited to share some more things about how to become professional facilitators and how to have amazing meetings.
Absolutely. If you have any questions you would like us to answer on air, or you'd like to be interviewed by us, just drop us a line at amazingmeetings.org. That's amazingmeetings.org. Until the next time, this is Bartosz signing off.
This is Louis saying bye. Bye.